Well, we come now this morning to the conclusion of the book of Ruth, this wonderful story. It's a short story, but it has these wonderful movements from famine to feast, from emptiness to fullness, from disobedience to covenant kindness. And so we come now to the end after Boaz has gone to the city gate in order to redeem Ruth, in order that he might marry her. Now we come to the end of the story, and almost a surprise genealogy at the end. It may not be how we would normally think of ending a love story, by including a genealogy at the end, but it does help us to focus and to see that though this story is wonderful to read, it has greater significance to it, and ultimately that, I think, is why the narrator chooses to end on that genealogy. And so we come to verse 13 of chapter 4. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her. And the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the genealogies of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. And so we come to the end. And as I said, most romantic comedies I've seen do not end with a genealogy at the end. But you'll just note the way in which this story ends, especially as it's placed here in our Bibles. It comes right before the book of Samuel and right after the book of Judges, and the very last word is actually the same last word in Hebrew, and it is David. And it would be written at a time, clearly it's written at a time in the future for Ruth, the story, and the narrator is writing about a past event that have happened. And so those who would have been reading this would have been aware of David the king, and much of Ruth does seem to be an apology or a defense of David's ancestry, how he has a Moabite in his family line. But also it paints this wonderful picture of his ancestors of Ruth and Boaz, how they are faithful Israelites, in this wonderful way in which a Moabite actually becomes an Israelite. And this would be ways in which would characterize not just King David, but David's greater son, the Lord Jesus Christ. And so we really have here, we have the resolution of the story of Ruth and Boaz, or what's finally happened at the end. How does this all culminate? But then we actually have not just a resolution, but a conclusion to the story, or why was it written? Because really without the conclusion, without that final genealogy, it ends up just being a nice story, which there's nothing wrong with nice stories. But that genealogy helps us see that this story of these 2 people, or these 3 people, Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz, has greater significance to God's people. And really at its core is the way in which the Lord has continued to do his work of protecting the line of the Messiah, and this joyful anticipation of what is to come, which is one of the reasons we decided to look at Ruth for Advent. And so as we come to the resolution of this story, or what has happened at the end, we see that Ruth and Boaz, that they are finally married. You'll remember the last section we looked at. Boaz went to the city gate in order to obtain Ruth as his wife, because there was a redeemer who was closer than Boaz. That all being concurred or concluded, he then now has full rights, if you will, to be able to take and marry Ruth and to be a redeemer for her and for her family. And so again, what started off very quickly with the demise of Ruth's husband And the emptiness or emptying of Naomi here now concludes at the end with this wonderful man Boaz, who has now taken Ruth as his wife. But then the story continues on. That's not just that they have been married, which is wonderful. Now Ruth will be taken care of. Naomi will be taken care of, and we know exactly how they'll be taken care of. But you'll notice the way in which the narrator ends. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. So not only did they get married, they consummated the marriage, and the Lord opens her womb, and she is able to bear a child. It does seem that behind the scenes, if you were, between the lines, there was 10 years in which Ruth was married to Mahlon, and there were no children. And it seems as if you can conclude that that type of barrenness there was possibly because of this disobedience from Mahlon and from his mother and his father, that they had no children in their marriage. So for 10 years, they were not able to conceive. But here, immediately, it seems as if Ruth and Boaz are married, and then this almost another coincidence happens, that they then become pregnant right away. But the narrator helpfully pulls back the scene and helps us to see that this wasn't just a chance happening, but rather it was the Lord who gave conception, the Lord who opens up Ruth's womb, and she bears a child. But also note the very specific gender of the child. It's not just that she has a child, which is wonderful to celebrate, but in this culture, she has a son. The inheritance has been a prime concern throughout Ruth. What will happen to Elimelech's name, his line, and his property? Well, now with a son being born, all of that is, if you will, almost tied up into a nice bow as it ends this story. A son has been born. The Lord has given a son, and that son has redeemed his family. Really has brought resurrection, hasn't he? Elimelech's line has been dead and buried, and now through this son, this line continues. And then we move quickly to the women of the town and to Naomi. So we almost, if you will, conclude the Ruth, Boaz, and son storyline. And now we come back to where we started. We started with Naomi leaving her homeland with her husband and 2 sons, returning back with no one but Ruth. And now, you'll remember, Naomi walks into town and they say, "This is Naomi, this is the pleasant one." And Naomi says, "Why call me Naomi? Why call me pleasant? Call me Mara, call me bitter. I left full and Yahweh brought me back empty." But now the women say, "Blessed be Yahweh, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel." And before we move on there, you'll see that the blessing that is going forth, this has really been a common theme throughout the book of Ruth, this idea of blessing others. One commentator said it really well, is that blessings just flow forth from everyone's mouth in the book of Ruth. It seems as if everyone must bless everyone else. It's this wonderful picture, almost of an idealized small microcosm of a society in the midst of what is just rampant evil in the time of the judges. Yet we have here these people where Boaz blesses his workers bless Boaz, he blesses Ruth, Ruth blesses him, Naomi blesses, and so on and so forth. And here the women bless Naomi, and they speak about the one who has come to her as a redeemer, that his name may be renowned in Israel. And if you just stop there, your mind probably goes to thinking, this is Boaz that she's talking about. Because earlier, Boaz has just been spoken of as a redeemer, and the elders of the city have blessed Boaz that his name would be renowned throughout Bethlehem. But here the women continue, "He shall be, this redeemer shall be to you, a restorer of life and nourisher of your old age." And so this redeemer that they're looking at is actually not Boaz. As you'll see later, Ruth has given birth to him at the end of verse 15. The one they're talking about, the redeemer they're talking about, is actually the child that has been born to Ruth and Boaz. This would be a redeemer. This would also be someone who would care for Naomi at an old age. And so Naomi has been blessed not only with Ruth and Boaz and some economic security there, but also she's been blessed with this son who will then also be there to care for her. But then the women of the town continue, "For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to you." I've always found it interesting at the beginning of Ruth, when Naomi returns and she speaks about her bitterness, she doesn't mention Ruth at all. It seems to be this very obvious missing thing from her vocabulary, that she's focused on everything that she has lost. She doesn't seem to be aware really of the disobedience that has led her here. And then she doesn't seem to realize the tremendous thing that Ruth has done in abandoning her family and abandoning really any economic security to come along because she loves her mother-in-law. And I do think over the story we start to see Naomi understand not only what Ruth has given up, but who Ruth is. And I think ultimately she sees through that to see the way in which the Lord has done this mighty work in her life through not only Boaz, but also through Ruth. And I think it's only fitting here that the women of the town recognize what I assume and what you hope Naomi has already recognized, is that this daughter-in-law of yours, she loves you and she's worth more to you than 7 sons. And again, thinking back to a day and age where sons were very necessary in order to carry on the family line and the family property, there's a sense here where the women of the town are saying this one daughter-in-law, who also, by the way, is a Moabite, is worth more to you than having this infinite number of complete and perfect sons. It's really hard for us to grasp because, nowadays when you ask somebody, what are you hoping for when they're pregnant? Usually it's just, we're hoping for a baby, right? We're hoping for a child. No one wants to be that parent who goes, well, I really want a boy, and then they end up with a girl, or I really want a girl, and they end up with a boy, right? We're happy for children, but here there was it was needed for you to have sons. Not that daughters were not loved, but sons were very much needed. And to say and compare Ruth to 7 sons is a high compliment, especially in this society. And that she has not only loved you, she's now given birth to this Redeemer. In verse 16, Naomi takes the child and lays him on her lap and becomes his nurse. And here it just seems as if Naomi now takes this child, this just loving embrace, recognition of all that God has shown in love to her, and she becomes really, nurse is probably not the best word. It'd be more akin to nanny. She's going to be the one that will help in the taking of care and raising of this child. And then the women continue. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Very peculiar here that it seems as if the townspeople have given him a name instead of Ruth and Boaz. And also the way in which they refer to this child, not as a child of Ruth and Boaz, but rather a son has been born to Naomi. And his name, Obed, is the same Hebrew word for servant, that he is one who will be of service, who will serve Naomi in her old age. She has been almost twice blessed with this daughter-in-law and now with this son. And the narrator then hints here at the end that he is the father of Jesse, the father of David, and then we'll go forth through this slightly longer genealogy. But before we get to that genealogy here at the end, again, coming back to that theme, the way in which the book of Ruth is all about the fulfillment of blessing. I think this is one of those themes as I've read and even preached some on the book of Ruth, I've really missed, because you get very focused on the ending of the story that, yes, Boaz is a type of Christ. Yes, Ruth is this wonderful Gentile who becomes a part of God's people. And yes, it's fathering the line of David and ultimately the line of the Messiah. But in the midst of all of this, it is truly, when you go back and look through it, the ways in which people bless one another. They bless one another. And you see, though God is certainly not absent from the story, you see the way in which he is working out if you will, through those blessings. People proclaim these blessings upon others, and obviously it's God's hand behind it that brings these blessings about. You can think of at the beginning in verses 8 and 9 of chapter 1 where Naomi wishes this blessing upon her 2 daughters-in-law, that they would find husbands and rest in peace. Well, what happens? Yahweh brings this about in the life of Ruth. Then in chapter 2, verse 12, Boaz speaks this blessing upon Ruth that she might find protection under the wings of Israel's God. Well, what happens? God ultimately does that through Boaz. He blesses Boaz for his acts of bringing rest and peace. And then he orchestrates this entire legal proceedings that Ruth might find true blessing, true rest, and peace. And one of the more interesting ones in verse 11 and 12, where they speak about the renown and the fame and all of this going forth from these actions that Boaz has done. This is actually one of those blessings that the people in this narrative don't see happening. It is something that takes later time and generations. The narrator knows, but these people here never see how Boaz's name and renown go forth. And finally, he blesses Naomi through Ruth with Obed. She has been greatly blessed by both Ruth and now this son. So if you think here at the ending of the book of Ruth, I mean, certainly one of the ways in which this points us further on in the gospel is simply the happy ending. It's just simply a joyful ending to what started as a sad story mired in sin and death. Now we have life and blessing. And in the midst of this story, we have those who just freely bless others, freely work for the good of others. And you think just here at the end of the book of Ruth, there is certainly the idea that, yes, we should seek to act like Ruth and Boaz. That's certainly a part of the story of showing how they have acted and encouraging us to be those who trust in the Lord, like Boaz and Ruth. But I think also for us as a church to just be remembered that we should be those who bless others. Think of how simple it is when what these people say. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord be with you. May you find shelter under His wings. May we be those who pray for the blessing of God to fall upon others. And then may we just be those who rejoice when we see God's blessing in the lives of others. Isn't that what the townspeople did? They rejoiced to see this great salvation that was accomplished. And again, you just come back to thinking about a church that regularly seeks to bless others, pray for blessing upon others, and rejoice in those blessings. Well, then that brings us now to this closing genealogy. We have, now these are the generations of in verse 18. And actually the way that the Hebrew works, verse 18 has this and connection, so that the last last 4 verses are very much connected to the whole story that has come before. The ESV uses now, these are the generations. You could easily say, and these are the generations. It's merely a way in which the Hebrew is connecting and connects with that which has come before. But also you'll have this phrase that from our series in Genesis should sound really familiar. These are the generations of. This ends up being one of the primary markers in the book of Genesis. If you were to find an outline in the book of Genesis, it really is, these are the generations of. And so here the narrator is seemingly purposely pulling back from the Genesis stories and bringing us forward to the birth of David. And one of the interesting things with this genealogy is that it does actually cover 800 years worth of time. And the thing that you'll see in Hebrew genealogies is that they're not maybe as precise as we would sometimes want them to be. Sometimes they'll drop out names in the middle in order to shorten the genealogy, sometimes so they can get certain numbers that they like. In this case, we actually have 10 genealogies, 10 people listed in this genealogy. And it really becomes the history of David and the history of Israel. And as we go through it, most of these names might be slightly familiar if you're familiar with Matthew's genealogy. One of the interesting things that actually didn't see come up in many commentaries is simply that if you think about who Boaz's father is? Boaz's father is Salmon. And as you turn to the genealogy in Matthew, which copies a lot of this, Matthew adds in one extra detail, doesn't he? Salmon and Rahab. I think that's interesting to just think that whether this is meaning that Salmon and Rahab are Boaz's direct parents or grandparents, either way, you end up with this interesting coincidence, if you will, that Boaz's mother or grandmother was a Gentile, was a Gentile turned Israelite who acted in a faithful way. And so you start to wonder, well, why is Boaz the way that he is? Well, it's speculative thinking, but if his grandmother is a Gentile who has become an Israelite, Boaz sees a faithful Gentile and immediately knows that this is the story. This is what God can do, and this is what God does. This is God who does these sorts of things to change those who are outsiders and bringing them in. But also Boaz would likely know then God's grace generationally. He would know how God's grace works, not just from him to his wife to his son, but how it has worked from his father to his mother to him and backwards. That Boaz could easily walk backwards through his genealogy and see how God has worked and look forward to how it will work in the future. And here the writer ends on the Davidic dynasty. The father of David, Jesse, and Jesse's father, Obed, who was the son of Ruth and Boaz. And you end up with these 10 blocks, 10 generational blocks. And again, I can't claim that I found this out myself by counting it, but a commentator brings this up, that you have roughly, you have 10 blocks from Adam to Noah, from Noah to Abraham, and from Abraham to Boaz. So you end up with this very interesting genealogy where Adam founded humanity, Noah founded a new humanity, Abraham founded a new people, and then Boaz founded the Davidic dynasty. That ultimately leads to the Messianic age. And so David here, we see his genealogy, we see his great-grandparents, and we see the writer of Ruth leaving us with David, this Messianic king, this man who was a king after God's own heart, who ruled as the best king, the archetype, the one in which Solomon was judged and fell short of, and the one ultimately Jesus Christ would come from, that would make David pale in comparison. But again, if you think of the historical context, the uncertainty of the time of the judges, the brokenness of the world that they lived in, I mean, it easily becomes quite easy to see the message of Ruth, the brokenness of the world in which we live in, the need for a king to come to bring peace. The time of the judges was anarchy. Doesn't look too much different from where we live. And the great need of the hour is the Son of David to come to bring blessing. That there was some temporary happiness, but ultimately it would be fulfilled in this perfect kingdom. And so the book of Ruth, I think in two ways, it shows us this wonderful happy ending. It shows the happy ending of the culmination of all these blessings that come to Ruth, Naomi, and to Boaz at the hand of God, but also it joyfully anticipates this great coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, the one who is the Prince of Peace, the one who is the great King, the one who is constantly being told to us he is the Son of David. He is the rightful King of the world. And Christmas is about remembering that he has come and looking forward to the fact that he is coming again. And so may we be those who rest in God's promises, rest in God's great blessings to us, and may we be those who look forward, just as the book of Ruth looks forward. May we look forward to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ again. Let us pray.